Captain Magnus, the Kraken Blackwood, stood 9 feet tall and cast shadows that made grown men weep. His hands could crush cannonballs, his voice could shatter ship masts, and his reputation terrorized every port from the Caribbean to the North Sea. No woman had ever looked at him with anything but fear or disgust. At 35, he had resigned himself to a life alone on the endless ocean. Then came Isabella Fairweather, the merchant's daughter with eyes like storm clouds and courage that defied logic. While other women fled from his presence, she stepped closer. While they saw a monster, she saw loneliness. While they heard only his thunderous roar, she listened for the gentle whisper underneath. But when rival pirates threaten everything he holds dear, will Magnus's fierce protection drive Isabella away forever? Or will she finally see that sometimes the biggest hearts come in the most intimidating packages? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Port Royal in shades of gold and amber as Isabella Fairweather stepped off the merchant vessel that had carried her from her quiet coastal home. The brass compass in her palm, her father's most treasured possession, caught the light as she consulted it. One final time, north by northeast, toward the docks where her father waited with news that would change everything. The port buzzed with activity that overwhelmed her senses. Merchants hawked exotic spices and silks, their voices competing with the creaking of ship masts and the splash of waves against weathered hulls. Salt air mixed with the aroma of rum and cooking fish, creating a symphony of scents both thrilling and intimidating. Isabella had never seen anything like the massive ship anchored at the harbor's edge. The tempest's fury towered over smaller vessels like a cathedral among cottages, her black hull gleaming with fresh tar and her sails furled with military precision. Even at rest, the ship radiated power and barely contained violence. "Stay clear of that one, miss," warned a grizzled dockworker. Noticing her stare, "That be Captain Blackwood's vessel. The Kraken himself commands her, and ain't no place for decent folk." But Isabella found herself drawn to the ship despite the warning. Something about its imposing presence spoke to the restless spirit that had driven her to leave her comfortable but suffocating life. She had always been different from other young women her age, more curious about the world beyond her small town, more willing to question the safe paths others expected her to follow. On the ship's deck, she could make out figures moving with purposeful efficiency. The crew of the Tempest Fury worked in coordinated silence, their movements speaking of years spent together, facing storms and battles. Unlike other pirate crews she'd heard stories about, these men seemed disciplined, almost military in their bearing. And then she saw him. Captain Magnus Blackwood emerged from the ship's cabin like a force of nature given human form. Even from a distance, his size was overwhelming, broader than any two normal men, tall enough that he had to duck beneath the ship's rigging. His long dark hair was tied back with a leather cord, revealing a face marked by scars that told stories of violence and survival. The dock workers around Isabella took unconscious steps backward as Magnus's gaze swept across the harbor. When his eyes passed over her, Isabella felt a jolt of something she couldn't name. Not fear, exactly, but recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting to see those storm-gray eyes that held depths she longed to explore. "Isabella," her father's voice broke the spell. Thomas Fairweather hurried toward her, his face creased with worry lines that hadn't been there when she'd last seen him 6 months ago. "Thank God you received my letter. We need to talk, and quickly." Thomas Fairweather had once been a prosperous merchant, but the man who embraced his daughter now seemed diminished somehow, as if the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. His clothes, while clean, showed signs of wear that spoke of reduced circumstances. "Father, what's happened? Your letter was so urgent, so vague." Thomas glanced around nervously, his eyes lingering on the Tempest's fury with obvious fear. "Not here, child. Too many ears, too many dangerous men. Come, let's get you settled at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. We'll talk privately there." As they walked away from the docks, Isabella couldn't resist one last look back at the massive ship. Captain Blackwood had disappeared, but she could still feel the memory of those penetrating eyes. Something told her their paths would cross again, though she couldn't imagine under what circumstances. The boarding house sat on a hill overlooking the harbour, its whitewashed walls and flower boxes, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn character of the port below. Miss Henderson, a matronly woman with kind eyes and flower-dusted hands, welcomed Isabella with the warmth of someone genuinely happy to see a friendly face. "Your father's been beside himself waiting for you," she confided, as she led Isabella to a simple but clean room. "Whatever troubles found him, he's been carrying it alone too long." That evening, as Isabella unpacked her few belongings, she found herself returning again and again to the window that offered a view of the harbour. The tempest's fury dominated the scene, her lanterns glowing like fallen stars against the darkening water. Somewhere aboard that ship was the giant of a man who had stirred something in her soul with just a glance. Tomorrow her father would explain the crisis that had summoned her here. Tonight, she could only wonder what role destiny intended for her to play in this dangerous new world she'd entered. The leather-bound ledger trembled in Thomas Fairweather's hands as he spread it open on the small table in Isabella's room. Each page documented a spiral into financial ruin that had begun with a single bad investment and snowballed into something far more dangerous than mere bankruptcy. "It started with the sugar plantation in Barbados," Thomas explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "The hurricane last season destroyed everything. I'd borrowed against future harvests, promised returns I couldn't deliver." Isabella studied the careful columns of numbers, each entry marking another step toward disgust. Her father had always been meticulous with his accounts, but these pages told a story of desperation, loans taken from increasingly questionable sources as legitimate lenders turned him away. "Father, surely there are legal remedies, bankruptcy proceedings, negotiations with creditors. Not when your creditor is Captain Silas Vex." Thomas's face went pale at the mention of the name. "He bought my debts from the others, consolidated them under his own terms that make me little more than his property until every coin is repaid." The sound of heavy boots on the boarding house stairs interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried up from below, strained with barely controlled fear. "He's here, Mr. Fairweather. Says he won't wait any longer." Isabella moved to the window and felt her blood run cold. Captain Vex stood in the street below, flanked by 4 men whose hands rested casually on their weapons. Like Magnus Blackwood's imposing but somehow noble presence, Vex radiated malice. His thin frame and sharp features reminded Isabella of a blade, all cutting edges and cold steel. "Send down the girl," Vex called up to the window where Isabella stood. "I want to see what collateral old Thomas has been hiding from me." "Absolutely not," Isabella replied, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. Several passers-by stopped to watch the confrontation, though none seemed inclined to intervene. "My father's debts are his own responsibility, not mine." Vex's laugh was like broken glass. Spirited. "I like that in a woman. Makes the eventual breaking so much more satisfying." Thomas moved to pull Isabella away from the window, but she held her ground. "How much does he owe you?" 5,000 pieces of 8, plus interest that grows daily." Vex's cold smile never wavered. "Your father thought he could hide you away, pretend he had no assets left to claim. But I know everything that happens in this port." From the corner of her eye, Isabella noticed a commotion near the docks. The crew of the Tempest's Fury had stopped their evening activities and were watching the scene unfold. Captain Blackwood himself had emerged from his cabin, his massive frame silhouetted against the ship's lanterns. "You have 1 week, Fairweather," Vex continued. 5,000 pieces or I start collecting payment in other ways. Your daughter looks like she'd fetch a fair price in the slave markets of Tortuga." Isabella's composure finally cracked. "You monster! How dare you?" Her words were cut short as a shadow fell across the street. Magnus Blackwood approached with the measured stride of a man confident in his power. Even Vex's hardened men stepped back as the giant pirate drew near. "Captain Vex," Magnus's voice rumbled like distant thunder. I believe you're disturbing the peace of this establishment. Blackwood. Vex's greeting carried the weight of old animosity. This is none of your concern. Private business between me and my debtor. When your business involves threatening innocent women in my port, it becomes my concern. Magnus positioned himself between Vex and the boarding house, his presence alone shifting the balance of power in the street. Isabella found herself leaning forward, straining to hear every word of the exchange below. Something in Magnus's protective stance spoke to her in ways she couldn't fully understand. Your port, Vex sneered. Since when do you concern yourself with the troubles of merchants and their spawn? Since now. Magnus's hand moved to rest on the pommel of his cutlass. Find another way to collect your debts. Vex, this family is under my protection. The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Isabella felt her heart skip as the implications settled over her. This giant of a man, this feared pirate captain, had just declared himself her protector based on nothing more than witnessing Vex's threats. Vex's eyes narrowed to slits. This isn't over, Blackwood. The girl's father still owes me protection or no protection. I'll have my payment one way or another. As Vex and his men retreated into the shadows, Magnus looked up at Isabella's window. Their eyes met across the distance, and Isabella felt that same jolt of recognition she'd experienced at the dock. In his gaze, she saw not the monster of reputation, but something far more complex and far more dangerous to her peace of mind. The water-stained pages of his mother's recipe book crackled as Magnus turned them carefully in the privacy of his cabin. The faded ink described simple meals, fish stew with herbs, bread pudding made from day-old loaves, apple tart sweetened with precious sugar. Each recipe carried memories of gentle hands and a voice that had sung lullabies before the world turned cruel. Magnus had been 7 when she died, leaving him with nothing but this book and the knowledge that kindness existed somewhere in the darkness. The recipes had become his secret refuge during the years of abuse that followed, a reminder that not all human touch brought pain. Now, at 35, he found himself thinking of those gentle memories as he contemplated the impossible situation he'd created by protecting Isabella Fairweather. What had possessed him to challenge Vex so publicly? The rational part of his mind knew he'd just made a dangerous enemy over people he barely knew. But when he'd seen that young woman's courage in the face of Vex's threats, something had stirred in him that had nothing to do with rational thought. A knock at his cabin door interrupted his brooding. Enter. First mate, William Cross stepped inside, his weathered face carefully neutral. Cross had sailed with Magnus for 15 years, long enough to read his captain's moods like weather patterns. The crew's wondering about your declaration tonight, Captain. Protecting merchants isn't exactly our usual trade. Magnus closed the recipe book and tucked it away in the hidden compartment where he kept his most precious possessions. The crew has concerns, questions more like. Vex has connections throughout the Caribbean. Cross him wrong, and it affects our ability to operate in half the ports we frequent. Magnus understood his first mate's worry. Piracy, even the relatively honorable version they practiced, depended on maintaining a delicate balance of power. Make too many enemies, and safe harbors became scarce. What would you have me do, William? Stand aside while he threatens to sell an innocent girl into slavery? Cross studied his captain's face with the attention of a man whose life had often depended on reading subtle signs. Since when do we involve ourselves in shore matters? You've always said the sea was our world, and the land could keep its troubles. Since a pair of storm-grey eyes had looked at him without fear, Magnus thought but didn't say. Instead, he moved to the cabin's stern windows, where he could see the lights of Port Royal twinkling like fallen stars. Perhaps it's time we expanded our definition of honor. The next morning brought news that Thomas Fairweather had found employment at the Salty Dog Tavern, sweeping floors and hauling barrels for a wage that would take decades to clear his debt. More interesting was the report that his daughter had taken work there as well, serving food and drink to sailors who hadn't seen a woman of her caliber in months. Magnus found himself walking past the tavern more frequently than his usual routine required. Through the windows he caught glimpses of Isabella moving among the tables with quiet dignity, treating even the roughest sailors with respectful courtesy that earned their surprising protection. "That be the lass you're protecting from Vex," observed Tobias Fletcher, Magnus's quartermaster, as they paused outside the tavern. "Brave little thing, ain't she? Most high-born ladies would be weeping in their rooms by now." Magnus watched Isabella deflect a drunk sailor's wandering hands with a firm but gentle redirection that left the man embarrassed rather than angry. "She's stronger than she looks. Strong enough to handle what's coming. Vex won't let this insult stand. He's already been asking questions about her, about you, building his next move." That evening, Magnus instructed Cross to assign rotating guards to watch the boarding house where Isabella stayed. The men grumbled about shore duty, but none dared question their captain's orders directly. Magnus's size and reputation commanded absolute obedience, even when his decisions seemed to defy logic. What Magnus couldn't command was his own peace of mind. He found himself lying awake in his cabin, staring at the ceiling while his thoughts circled around the impossible situation he'd created. Isabella Fairweather was everything he could never have. Refined, educated, from a world that would never accept a giant pirate as anything but a monster. Yet something in her gaze had suggested she saw him differently. When their eyes met across the street during his confrontation with Vex, he'd glimpsed not fear or disgust, but curiosity, perhaps even gratitude. It was a dangerous foundation for the feelings growing in his chest, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The embroidered handkerchief had been a gift from Isabella's mother before her death. Delicate white linen adorned with tiny blue flowers that seemed to dance in the afternoon light. Isabella had never imagined she would use it to clean blood from a pirate's wounds. Yet here she knelt beside Magnus Blackwood in the alley behind the Salty Dog Tavern, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "You shouldn't be here," Magnus said through gritted teeth, though he made no move to stop her ministrations. "If anyone sees, let them see." Isabella dipped the cloth in clean water and gently cleaned the gash across his knuckles. "You were defending those young sailors from Captain Reeves's men. Someone should tend to your injuries." Magnus had intervened when 3 of Reeves's crew cornered a pair of merchant sailors barely out of boyhood, intent on robbery and worse. The fight had been brief but vicious, ending with Reeves's men unconscious in the mud and Magnus sporting several cuts from their knives. "Most people would say I was simply choosing my victims," Magnus observed, watching Isabella's careful attention to his wound. Her touch was impossibly gentle for someone tending to hands that had dealt death more times than he could count. "Most people are fools." Isabella's matter-of-fact response surprised him into silence. "I've been watching you, Captain Blackwood, the way your crew respects rather than fears you, the way you paid Mrs. Henderson for my father's room when you thought no one was looking. The way you've stationed guards to watch over us without making it feel like imprisonment." Magnus felt heat rise in his cheeks, an unfamiliar sensation that had nothing to do with pain. "You notice." "I notice many things others miss." Isabella finished cleaning the last cut and reached for her small sewing kit. "This one needs stitches. Hold still." The intimacy of the moment struck Magnus like a physical blow. No woman had ever touched him with such gentle purpose. Even the ship's surgeon, when tending his battle wounds, worked with the detached efficiency of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary task. Isabella's attention felt different, personal, caring, as if his pain mattered to her beyond its practical implications. "Why?" he asked as she began the delicate work of closing the wound. "Why risk your reputation to help someone like me?" Isabella paused in her stitching to meet his eyes. "Because someone like you risked his reputation to help someone like me. It seems a fair exchange." Magnus found himself studying her face with the intensity he usually reserved for reading weather patterns or enemy movements. Her features were fine but not delicate. There was strength in the set of her jaw, intelligence in her storm-grey eyes, and something else he was afraid to name for fear of crushing it with his hope. "Tell me about your travels," Isabella said as she worked, perhaps sensing his need for distraction from her touch. "What's the most beautiful place you've seen?" The question caught Magnus off guard. Most people asked about his battles, his reputation, the fear he inspired. No one had ever asked about beauty. "There's an island south of Jamaica," he said slowly, the memory rising unbidden. "Small enough to walk across in an hour, but covered in flowers I'd never seen before. Pink and gold and deep purple, growing wild without anyone to tend them. The water there is so clear you can see fish swimming 30 feet down, and the sand is white as fresh snow. It sounds magical." Isabella's voice carried a wistful quality that made Magnus's chest tighten. "I've always dreamed of seeing such place. Life in a small coastal town offers little adventure. Adventure isn't always pleasant," Magnus warned. "The sea can be cruel, and the life of a sailor is hard. But it's also free." Isabella finished the last stitch and tied off the thread with practiced precision. "Free from the expectations others place on you. Free to make your own choices, see your own horizons." Magnus flexed his hand experimentally, testing her work. The stitches were neat and precise, the kind of careful craftsmanship that spoke of patience and skill. "Where did you learn to sew wounds?" "My mother was the closest thing our town had to a physician. She taught me that healing hands were a gift to be shared, regardless of the person needing help." Isabella began packing away her supplies. "She would have liked you." The simple statement hit Magnus harder than any blow he'd taken in the fight. "Your mother would have liked a giant pirate with blood on his hands. She would have seen what I see, someone who uses his strength to protect rather than to prey. Someone who carries gentleness in his heart, despite the hardness the world has forced upon him." Magnus stared at her in wonder, this remarkable woman who seemed to see straight through to his soul. The Kraken's tooth hanging around Magnus's neck had been a symbol of his strength for 15 years, a trophy taken from the beast that had nearly destroyed his ship and crew off the coast of Bermuda. Now, as he fingered the polished ivory pendant in the privacy of his cabin, it felt more like a chain binding him to a version of himself he was no longer certain he wanted to be. 3 weeks had passed since Isabella had tended his wounds, and Magnus found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about his own nature. The fearsome reputation he'd spent years building suddenly felt like armor that had grown too heavy to bear. "You've been different lately, Captain," observed William Cross during their evening meeting to review the ship's accounts. The crews noticed. "They're wondering if the Fairweather girl has put some kind of spell on you." Magnus looked up from the ledger where he'd been recording their latest cargo manifest, legitimate goods purchased with honest coin rather than taken by force. Another change that hadn't gone unnoticed by his men. "What kind of spell?" "The kind that makes a man forget who he is." Cross leaned back in his chair, studying his captain with the frankness of an old friend. "We're pirates, Magnus. It's a hard life, but it's our life. Don't let some merchant's daughter make you think you can be something you're not." The words stung because they echoed Magnus's own fear. What was he thinking, allowing himself to imagine a future with Isabella? She came from a world of respectability and social standing, while he was a giant who'd earned his place in the world through violence and intimidation. Yet when Thomas Fairweather had cornered him outside the tavern that morning, forbidding him from any further contact with Isabella, Magnus had felt something crack inside his chest. The older man's words had been polite but firm. His daughter was a lady, not entertainment for pirates, and Magnus's protection was appreciated, but should not be confused with permission for anything more personal. "She deserves better than this life," Magnus said finally, closing the ledger with more force than necessary. "Aye, she does, and you deserve better than to torture yourself over something that can never be." But Cross didn't understand. No one could understand the miracle of being seen as human by someone like Isabella. When she looked at him, Magnus didn't feel like a monster or a curiosity. He felt like a man worthy of gentleness, worthy of the kind of love he'd read about in the books he kept hidden in his cabin. Those books, poetry and philosophy, adventure tales and treatises on navigation, were another secret he guarded carefully. Pirates weren't supposed to be scholars, but Magnus had educated himself during long nights at sea, hungry for knowledge that might someday lift him above his circumstances. That evening, despite Thomas Fairweather's prohibition, Magnus found himself walking past the boarding house where Isabella lived. She appeared at her window as if she'd been watching for him, and their eyes met in the lamplight spilling from her room. Isabella held up a single finger, wait, then disappeared from view. Minutes later, she emerged from the boarding house's side door, moving with the careful stealth of someone accustomed to evading detection. "Your father forbade me from speaking with you," Magnus said as she approached. "My father is scared and desperate, which makes him say foolish things." Isabella's defiance sparked like flint against steel. "He thinks you'll compromise my reputation, as if working in a tavern filled with sailors hasn't already accomplished that." They walked in comfortable silence toward the harbor, where moonlight painted silver paths across the water. The Tempest's fury rode at anchor like a sleeping giant, her presence both reassuring and intimidating. "I have something for you," Isabella said, reaching into her coat pocket. She withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth, a flower from the garden behind the boarding house, pressed between glass and mounted in a simple wooden frame. Magnus accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly despite their size and strength. The flower was a common variety, something that might grow wild in any tropical garden, but preserved with care it became something precious. "Why?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "Because I wanted you to have something beautiful, something that wasn't taken by force or bought with fear." Isabella's words carried a weight that made Magnus's chest tighten. "You protect so many people, but who protects the protector? Who gives you gentle things?" Magnus stared at the pressed flower as if it were a treasure beyond price. In his world of violence and survival, beauty was a luxury he'd taught himself not to want. But here was Isabella, offering him a piece of paradise with hands that shook not from fear, but from the vulnerability of giving. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "That's not for you to decide," Isabella replied firmly. "That's for me to decide, and I've decided you deserve far more than the world has given you." The pressed flower from Isabella's garden now sat on Magnus's desk beside his navigation charts, its delicate beauty a stark contrast to the instruments of war and seamanship that dominated his cabin. He found himself glancing at it throughout each day, a reminder that somewhere in Port Royal, a remarkable woman believed he deserved gentle things. His crew had begun to notice the changes in their captain's behavior with increasing curiosity and concern. Where once Magnus had been quick to settle disputes with his commanding presence, he now attempted reasoning first. Where he had previously accepted the brutal necessities of piracy, without question, he'd begun steering them toward more legitimate venture. "Captain's gone soft," Magnus overheard one of the younger crew members whisper to his companion as they worked on deck repairs. "Ever since that merchant's daughter started making eyes at him." Tobias Fletcher quickly silenced the gossip with a sharp word, but Magnus knew the sentiment was spreading. His men had followed him because he was the strongest, the most feared, the most successful pirate captain in the Caribbean. If they began to see him as weak, his authority would crumble faster than a ship's hull in a hurricane. Yet Magnus found himself caring less about his fearsome reputation with each passing day. The previous evening's encounter with Isabella had awakened something in him that he'd thought permanently buried beneath years of necessary brutality. At the Salty Dog Tavern, Isabella moved through her duties with quiet efficiency, but Magnus could see the toll that her father's financial troubles were taking. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usual vibrant energy seemed dimmed by worry and exhaustion. Captain Vex had made his presence felt throughout the week, appearing at the tavern each evening to remind Thomas Fairweather of his mounting debt. The interest alone was growing faster than any honest wage could cover, and everyone understood that Vex was merely waiting for the debt to reach a level that would justify more drastic collection methods. 5 days left, Vex announced loudly enough for the entire tavern to hear as he cornered Thomas near the bar. "Then we discuss alternative forms of payment." His meaningful glance toward Isabella left no doubt about what alternatives he had in mind. Magnus watched the exchange from his usual corner table, his massive hands clenched into fists that could have crushed Vex's skull like an eggshell. But direct violence would only escalate the situation and potentially put Isabella in greater danger. That night, defying both her father's prohibition and the risks involved, Isabella met Magnus at their secret spot near the harbor. The pressed flower had given her an idea, and she'd brought with her a small collection of her most treasured possessions. "These were my mother's," she said, unwrapping a set of silver hair combs adorned with tiny pearls. "And this belonged to my grandmother." She showed him a delicate gold locket containing a miniature portrait of a stern-faced woman with Isabella's storm-grey eyes. "Isabella, what are you? I want to sell them." She interrupted, her voice steady despite the pain. Magnus could see in her expression. "They're worth enough to make a significant payment toward father's debt. Not enough to clear it entirely, but enough to buy us time." Magnus felt something fierce and protective surge through his chest. "Absolutely not. Those are family heirlooms, memories of the women who shaped you. I won't let you sacrifice them for what? For my father's mistakes? For my own survival?" Isabella's eyes flashed with a combination of determination and desperation that broke Magnus's heart. "They're just things, Magnus. Beautiful things, precious things, but still just objects. My freedom is worth more than silver and gold." The use of his given name sent a shock through Magnus's system. She'd never called him anything but Captain Blackwood before, maintaining the proper distance her position required. But here, in the moonlight with her most precious possessions spread between them like offerings, she spoke to him as an equal. "There has to be another way," Magnus said, though his mind was already racing through possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. "Captain Vex has made it clear that he's willing to wait only so long for conventional payment. After that," Isabella shuddered at implications too terrible to voice. "I won't be sold into slavery to pay for my father's debts. I'd rather die first." The quiet conviction in her voice terrified Magnus more than any storm or battle he'd ever faced. The thought of Isabella choosing death over dishonor made him realize how completely she'd captured his heart and how far he was willing to go to protect her. "What if there was a third option?" he asked carefully. "What if someone else paid your father's debt?" Isabella studied his face in the flickering light of the harbor lanterns. "Someone like who?" "Someone who has enough gold to clear the debt and enough reputation to make Vex think twice about future harassment." Understanding dawned in Isabella's eyes, followed quickly by alarm. "Magnus, no, I can't let you. You're not letting me do anything," Magnus replied firmly. "I'm choosing to do it. There's a difference." The tiny wooden ship sat in Magnus's palm like a fragment of childhood innocence preserved against all odds. Barely 3 inches long and carved from driftwood, it bore the careful attention of small hands and the dream of a boy who believed the world held more wonder than cruelty. Magnus had been 8 when he'd carved it during his first terrible year on the streets, before hunger and desperation had forced him into the brutal apprenticeship that would shape his future. "You made this?" Isabella asked, her voice soft with wonder as she examined the delicate craftsmanship. They sat in Magnus's cabin aboard the Tempest Fury, the first time she'd set foot on his ship despite their weeks of secret meetings. "Before I knew what the world really was," Magnus replied, his voice carrying the weight of lost innocence. "Before I learned that dreams are luxuries only the strong can afford." Isabella traced the tiny ship's miniature rigging with one finger, her touch reverent. "Tell me what happened to that boy." The invitation to share his past hung between them like a bridge over dangerous waters. Magnus had never told anyone the complete story of his transformation from hopeful child to feared pirate. But something in Isabella's patient attention encouraged honesty in ways he'd never experienced. "My parents died when I was 7 fever, took them both within a week. I had no relatives willing to claim a boy who was already too large for his age, too strange-looking to inspire sympathy." Magnus moved to the stern windows, staring out at the harbor lights. "The orphanage kept me for 6 months before deciding I was too much trouble. Too many fights, too much food required, too frightening to the other children." Isabella remained silent, allowing him to tell his story at his own pace. Outside, the gentle creaking of ship's timbers provided a soothing rhythm to his painful memories. "The streets of Kingston taught me that size could be a weapon or a target, depending on how you used it. I learned to fight because the alternative was death. I learned to steal because the alternative was starvation. And eventually I learned to inspire fear because it was the only way to survive." How did you become a pirate? Magnus's laugh held no humor. Captain Mordecai Cross. William's uncle found me trying to steal food from his ship when I was 12. I was already 6 feet tall and strong enough to do a man's work. He gave me a choice: join his crew or have my hands cut off for thievery. The wooden ship seemed to grow heavier in his palm as the memories continued to pour out. Cross wasn't entirely cruel by pirate standard. He fed me, taught me to sail, showed me how to use my size as an advantage rather than a burden. But he also taught me that mercy was weakness, that taking what you wanted was the only reliable path to security. Isabella moved closer, her presence offering comfort without judgment. What happened to him? Fever, same as my parents. By then I was 20, and large enough that the crew feared me more than they mourned him. They elected me captain because they thought I'd be the most successful at keeping them alive and wealthy. Magnus finally looked at Isabella, studying her face for signs of the revulsion his story surely deserved. I've been exactly what they needed me to be ever since. Instead of horror, Magnus saw something that looked remarkably like understanding in Isabella's storm-grey eyes. And now I find myself wondering if there might be another way to live. Magnus set the wooden ship carefully on his desk beside her. Pressed flower. You make me remember that boy who carved ships and dreamed of adventures that didn't require hurting people. Isabella reached for his hands, covering his massive knuckles with her smaller fingers. That boy is still there, Magnus. I can see him every time you're gentle with someone who expects brutality. Every time you choose protection over violence. Every time you look at me like I'm something precious instead of something to be conquered. The intimacy of her touch sent electricity racing through Magnus's entire body. No one had ever spoken to him about gentleness as if it were a virtue rather than a weakness. No one had ever suggested that his capacity for tenderness was as valuable as his capacity for violence. I want to show you something, Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something I've never told another living soul. She reached into her coat and withdrew a folded paper, a map drawn in her own careful hand. I've been planning an escape from my old life long before my father's troubles brought us to Port Royal. There's a place I've read about, an island called Serenity Cove. It's small, uninhabited, but with fresh water and fertile soil. I used to dream of starting over there, building something new. Magnus studied the map, noting the careful attention to detail, the research that had gone into its creation. You want to run away, yes? I want to be free, Isabella corrected. Free to choose my own path, to live by my own values. And now, she looked directly into his eyes, her courage taking his breath away. I want you to come with me. The gold wedding ring gleamed dully in the pawnbroker's grimy hand, its simple elegance a stark contrast to the cluttered shop, filled with desperate people's abandoned treasure. Thomas Fairweather watched as the last tangible reminder of his beloved wife disappeared into the merchant's cash box, trading 30 years of marriage for enough coin to buy perhaps another week of Vex's patience. 50 pieces of 8. The pawnbroker declared with the casual indifference of a man who'd seen countless family heirlooms cross his counter. Final offer. Thomas nodded numbly, accepting the pathetically small sum that represented everything he had left to sell. His daughter's silver combs, his late wife's pearl necklace, even the brass compass that had belonged to his father, all had found their way to this squalid shop in exchange for time he couldn't afford and hope he no longer possessed. Isabella waited outside, unable to bear watching her family's legacy dissolve piece by piece. When her father emerged, she could read the outcome in his defeated posture and the way his hands shook as he counted the meager coins. It's not enough, Thomas said unnecessarily. Even with what we've already paid, Vex still claims we owe him over 4,000 pieces of 8. The interest alone grows faster than we can earn. Isabella felt the familiar weight of helplessness settle over her shoulders like a yoke. No matter how many hours she worked at the tavern, no matter what sacrifices they made, the debt seemed to grow rather than shrink. Vex had structured his loans to ensure that his debtors could never escape, turning temporary financial difficulty into permanent servitude. There is another option, Isabella said quietly, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. Thomas looked at his daughter with the sharp attention of a drowning man seeing a rope. What option? Captain Blackwood has offered to pay the debt. The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. Thomas's face cycled through surprise, alarm, and finally a resignation that broke Isabella's heart. And what would he expect in return? Thomas asked, though they both knew the answer. Nothing he hasn't already given freely. Protection, respect, kindness. Isabella's voice carried a conviction she wasn't entirely sure she felt. He's not like other pirates, father. He's gentle underneath all that size and reputation. Gentle or not, he's still a pirate. And you're still my daughter. Thomas's voice cracked with the weight of impossible choices. What kind of father accepts charity from a man who might compromise his child's virtue? Isabella wanted to tell her father that Magnus would never compromise anything about her that she didn't freely offer. She wanted to explain that the giant pirate had shown her more respect and tenderness than any of the respectable young men her father had once hoped she might marry. But such explanations would only reveal how deeply her feelings for Magnus had grown, and that knowledge would destroy what remained of her father's peace of mind. "We're running out of alternatives," Isabella said instead. "Vex has made his intentions clear. If we can't pay, he'll take compensation in other forms." The threat hung between them unspoken, but understood. Captain Vex's reputation for cruelty extended far beyond simple debt collection. Women who fell into his power rarely emerged unchanged if they emerged at all. "There might be another way," Thomas said suddenly, his voice carrying a strange note that made Isabella's stomach clench with apprehension. "I received a letter yesterday from your uncle." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. Her uncle was a man she'd never met, but had heard whispered about in family conversations, a government official of some kind who'd made it clear years ago that her father's merchant family was beneath his notice. "What kind of letter?" Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew a piece of expensive paper sealed with official wax. "He knows about our troubles. Apparently word of our situation has reached certain circles in the colonial government. He's offering to clear our debts entirely in exchange." Thomas's voice faltered as he tried to force out the words, "In exchange for your hand in marriage to his business associate, a plantation owner in need of a wife." The world seemed to tilt around Isabella as the implications sank in. Her mysterious uncle, whoever he was offering to purchase her like a piece of property, trading her freedom for her father's financial salvation. "I won't do it," Isabella said flatly. "I won't be sold into marriage to pay for debts I didn't create. The alternative is letting Captain Blackwood destroy his reputation and possibly his life to save us," Thomas replied. "Is that any more fair?" Isabella thought of Magnus's gentle hands holding her pressed flower, of the vulnerability in his storm-grey eyes when he'd shared his painful past, of the way he looked at her as if she was something precious beyond measure. The idea of dragging him into her family's troubles felt like a betrayal of everything beautiful growing between them. But the alternative, marriage to a stranger, a life of servitude disguised as respectability, felt like death itself. The forged Royal Navy commission crackled in Captain Vex's hands like a death warrant, waiting to be served. The document, expertly crafted by the best forgers in Tortuga, bore official seals and signatures that would convince even experienced naval officers of its authenticity. According to its carefully worded text, Captain Magnus Blackwood was guilty of high treason against the Crown, a crime that carried an automatic sentence of death by hanging. "Beautiful work, isn't it?" Vex murmured to his first mate as they studied the false document by lamplight in his cab. "Cost me 300 pieces of 8 and a promise to the forger's widow, but it will be worth every coin when I present it to the governor." Vex had been planning this trap for weeks, ever since Magnus's public challenge had humiliated him in front of half the port. But the final piece of his revenge had only fallen into place that morning, when an unexpected visitor had arrived at his ship with information that changed everything. The woman who stood before him now was nothing like the terrified merchant's daughter she pretended to be. Dressed in fine silk beneath her common cloak, she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of nobility. Her storm-grey eyes held intelligence and determination that spoke of education and privilege far beyond Thomas Fairweather's modest means. "Miss Isabella Fairweather," Vex said with mock courtesy, "or should I say, Lady Isabella Pemberton, niece to Governor Edmund Pemberton of Jamaica." Isabella's composure never wavered, though Vex could see the tension in her shoulders. "I prefer Miss Fairweather. I've grown rather fond of the name." "I'm sure you have. Nothing quite like playing at being common folk, is there? Slumming with pirates and merchants, pretending your family doesn't control half the shipping routes in the Caribbean." Vex circled her like a shark scenting blood. "Tell me, your ladyship, does your giant captain know who you really are?" The slight tightening around Isabella's eyes gave Vex his answer. Magnus Blackwood, the infamous Kraken, had been played for a fool by a governor's niece, seeking adventure among the lower classes. "I assume you have a proposition," Isabella said, her voice steady, despite the danger of her situation. "Otherwise you wouldn't have sent word through that tavern girl that you'd harm my father unless I came alone." "Indeed I do." Vex moved to his desk and withdrew the forged commission. "This document will see your beloved captain hanging from a gibbet within the week, unless, of course, certain accommodations can be reached." Isabella's mask finally slipped, revealing the fear she'd been hiding. "What kind of accommodation?" "First, you're going to return to your uncle and resume your proper place in society. No more playing at being a working girl, no more embarrassing the family name with your romantic entanglement with a pirate. And second," Vex's smile was sharp as a blade, "you're going to help me destroy Magnus Blackwood completely. Your uncle has been looking for an excuse to clean up Port Royal's pirate problem, and I'm going to give him one. Blackwood's protection of your family will be painted as an attempt to use you against the colonial government. With your testimony about his behavior." Vex let the implication hang unfinished. "You want me to lie about Magnus, to accuse him of crimes he didn't commit. I want you to tell the truth about what he is, a violent criminal who threatened a government official's family. The fact that you're that official's niece simply adds weight to the charges." Isabella stared at the forged document as if it were a coiled snake. "And if I refuse, then your father's debt becomes the least of your problem. This commission reaches the governor regardless, but without your cooperation Magnus will die believing you deceived him about everything. He'll go to his death thinking the woman he loved was nothing but a spoiled aristocrat, amusing herself with a pet monster." The cruelty of the choice Vex offered was breathtaking in its completeness. Isabella could save Magnus's life by destroying his heart, or she could preserve their love while watching him die for crimes he didn't commit. "There's something else you should know," Vex continued, savoring her anguish. "Your uncle didn't just offer to pay your father's debts. He's been searching for you for months, ever since you disappeared from your engagement party to Lord Ashworth. Quite the scandal in polite society, I'm told. A governor's niece running away from a perfectly suitable marriage to play at independence." Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her old life closing in around her. She'd thought she'd escaped the suffocating expectations of nobility, found something real and precious with Magnus. Now that freedom was revealed as an illusion, bought with time that had finally run out. "How long do I have to decide?" "Until tomorrow's tide. After that, I present the commission to your uncle with or without your cooperation." Vex's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd constructed a perfect trap. "Choose wisely, your ladyship. Some games have consequences that last a lifetime." The letter from Governor Edmund Pemberton bore the official seal of Jamaica's colonial government, its heavy paper and formal script a stark reminder of the world Isabella had tried to leave behind. She held it with trembling fingers as she stood on the deck of the Tempest's Fury, knowing that its contents would shatter whatever remained of her carefully constructed new life. Magnus watched from across the cabin as she broke the seal, his storm-grey eyes reflecting a pain that cut her deeper than any physical wound. Since her return from the meeting with Vex, she'd been unable to meet his gaze directly, knowing that her deception was written across her face like a scarlet brand. "My dearest niece," the letter began in her uncle's precise handwriting, "your continued absence from society has caused considerable concern among your family and friends. Lord Ashworth has been most patient regarding your temporary indisposition, but his patience and mine has limited. You will present yourself at Government House within 24 hours, or I will be forced to take more direct measures to ensure your return to your proper place in society." The words that followed detailed the life Isabella had fled. A marriage to a man 3 times her age, a future as decorative property in a world that valued women only for their ability to produce heirs and manage households. Her uncle's letter made it clear that her brief taste of freedom was over, her rebellion nothing more than a childish tantrum to be corrected with firm authority. "Isabella," Magnus's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the hurt beneath his measured tone. "Is there something you need to tell me?" She looked up to find him holding a second letter, this one bearing the governor's official summons for Magnus to appear before a naval tribunal on charges of threatening a government official's family. The forged commission from Vex wasn't mentioned, but its shadow hung over the formal accusations like a sword waiting to fall. "You're the governor's niece." It wasn't a question. Magnus had clearly pieced together the truth from the correspondence and her inability to deny it. Yes, the word came out as barely a whisper, but it might as well have been a shout for the way it seemed to echo in the cabin's sudden silence. Magnus set down the tribunal summons with careful precision, his massive hands steady despite the turmoil. Isabella could see in his eyes. "How long have you been lying to me? I never lied to you about anything that mattered." The words sounded hollow, even to Isabella's own ears. "My feelings for you, my respect for who you are. None of that was false, but everything else was." Magnus moved to the stern windows, putting distance between them that felt like an ocean. "Your name, your background, your circumstances. You're not a merchant's daughter struggling to survive. Your nobility playing at being common folk." Isabella felt her heart breaking with each word, knowing that her deception had destroyed the trust that had been the foundation of their relationship. "I ran away from an arranged marriage, from a life that would have suffocated everything I valued about myself. When I found you, when I found this life, it felt real in ways my old existence never did." "Real?" Magnus's laugh held no humor. "Was I real to you, Isabella, or was I just part of your adventure? The dangerous pirate to add excitement to your rebellion against family expectations." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Not because it was true, but because Isabella could see how her deception made it seem plausible. From Magnus's perspective, their entire relationship had been built on lies. She was the governor's niece, educated and privileged, while he was a pirate whose reputation had been earned through violence and necessity. "You were the most real thing in my life," Isabella said desperately. "You still are. My title, my family connections, they're the false parts of who I am. This person, the woman who fell in love with your gentleness and strength, she's the truth of who I've always wanted to be." Magnus turned from the window, and Isabella saw something die in his eyes. "Your uncle's summons makes the situation clear. You return to your proper place, or I face charges that will likely end with my execution. Captain Vex has made sure of that." Isabella's blood ran cold. "Vex told you about his ultimatum. He didn't need to." The timing of these letters, the specific accusations, it's obvious someone orchestrated this to force your compliance. Magnus's voice carried the weary resignation of a man who'd always known his happiness was too good to last. "You should go, Isabella. Return to Government House. Marry your lord. Live the life your family planned for you. I won't abandon you. You won't have a choice." Magnus moved to his desk and began gathering papers, his actions deliberately final. "I'm ordering you off my ship. Tonight. For your own protection and mine." Isabella felt the walls of her world collapsing around her. In trying to protect both her father and Magnus, She'd lost them both. Her deception, born from a desire to escape an unwanted life, had trapped her more completely than any cage her family could have constructed. The battle-worn cutlass had drawn blood in more fights than Magnus could count, its blade nicked and scarred from years of defending his life and his crew's survival. Now, as he strapped the familiar weapon to his side, Magnus felt the weight of its history, not as a tool of conquest, but as an instrument of protection. Tonight it would serve love rather than fear, honor rather than greed. "Captain, this is madness," William Cross said, for the third time as Magnus checked his pistols and secured extra powder charges in his belt. "Vex has Isabella on his ship, surrounded by his crew, with cannon pointed at the harbor mouth. It's a trap designed to get you killed." Magnus knew his first mate was right. Vex's message had been brutally clear. Come alone to the Devil's Maiden at midnight, or Isabella would pay the price for Magnus's defiance. The location, a secluded cove 20 minutes sail from Port Royal, offered no escape routes and plenty of opportunities for ambush. "Then it's a trap I'll spring on my own terms," Magnus replied, sliding a second cutlass into his belt. His massive frame could handle the extra weight, and he suspected he'd need every advantage against Vex's superior numbers. The crew of the Tempest Fury had volunteered to accompany their captain, despite the obvious danger, but Magnus had refused their offer. This was his fight, born from his decision to protect Isabella. He wouldn't risk his men's lives for his personal battles. "At least take a few of us as backup," Tobias Fletcher urged. "Station us offshore where we can provide covering fire if things go bad." Magnus considered the suggestion, then shook his head. "Vex will be watching for exactly that kind of support. If he sees other ships in the area, he'll assume betrayal, and Isabella will suffer for it." What Magnus didn't tell his crew was that he'd already made peace with the possibility of not returning from this confrontation. If saving Isabella required his life, it was a trade he'd make without hesitation. She'd shown him what it meant to be seen as human rather than monster, to be valued for gentleness rather than feared for strength. That gift was worth any price. The small boat Magnus commandeered for the journey to Devil's Maiden was barely large enough for his massive frame, but its shallow draft would allow him to approach the cove from unexpected angles. He'd studied every chart of the area, memorizing currents and tide patterns that might provide tactical advantages. As he rowed through the moonlit waters, Magnus found his thoughts drifting to Isabella's face the last time he'd seen her. Pale with anguish, beautiful with desperate courage. She'd tried to explain her deception, to make him understand that her feelings were real despite the lies surrounding them. Part of him believed her, wanted to forgive everything for the chance to hold her again. But another part of him, the part shaped by years of betrayal and survival, wondered if she was simply another person who'd seen him as useful rather than worthy of truth. The uncertainty gnawed at him like physical pain. The Devil's Maiden came into view as Magnus rounded the final point of land protecting the cove. Vex's ship sat at anchor with lanterns burning fore and aft, her gun ports open to display the cannon that could turn Magnus's small boat into splinters with a single broadside. On deck, Magnus could see figures moving, Vex's crew preparing for whatever violence the night might bring. At the ship's bow, a smaller figure stood bound to the mainmast. Even at a distance, Magnus recognized Isabella's defiant posture, the way she held her head high despite her circumstances. Vex had positioned her where Magnus would see her immediately, a reminder of what was at stake. "Ahoy there, Blackwood," Vex's voice carried across the water as Magnus approached. "Right on time. I do appreciate punctuality in my enemies." Magnus said nothing as he maneuvered his boat alongside the Devil's Maiden. Rope ladders had been lowered for his ascent, but he could see armed men positioned at strategic points around the deck. Whatever Vex had planned, it involved more than a simple prisoner exchange. "Before you board my ship," Vex called down, "I want to make sure you understand the rules of tonight's entertainment. You're here because you value this woman's life above your own. Admirable, if foolish. But I wonder how much you'll value her when you learn the whole truth about your precious Isabella." Magnus began climbing the rope ladder, his weight making the ship's side creak ominously. Each rung brought him closer to Isabella, closer to whatever trap Vex had prepared, closer to a confrontation that would determine whether love could triumph over deception and hatred. "Welcome aboard, Captain Blackwood," Vex said with mock courtesy as Magnus hauled himself over the rail. "Now let me introduce you properly to Lady Isabella Pemberton, niece to the governor, runaway bride, and apparently quite the accomplished actress when it comes to manipulating the hearts of lonely giants." The ship's bell of the Tempest's fury rang out across Port Royal's harbour, its bronze voice carrying a message that every pirate crew understood: their captain was in mortal danger, and honour demanded response. William Cross had defied Magnus's direct orders by gathering the crew for a rescue mission. But loyalty ran deeper than obedience when a good captain's life hung in the balance. "He said to stay behind," muttered young Tom Bristol as he checked his pistol's priming. "Said this was his fight alone." "Aye, and he's a stubborn fool for thinking it," Cross replied, studying the charts spread across the ship's table. "But he's our stubborn fool, and we don't abandon crew, especially not the captain who's kept us alive and wealthy for 15 years. Tobias Fletcher traced the route to Devil's Maiden with one weathered finger. 20 minutes sail in good wind, but Vex will have lookouts posted. Soon as they spot our approach, Isabella's dead and Magnus with her. Then we don't approach where they're looking," Cross said grimly. He pointed to a series of small islands north of the cove. "Shallow water, barely enough draft for our boats, but if we beach here and approach overland, that's near a mile of rough terrain in the dark," Fletcher protested. "Rock falls, thorny brush, enough noise to wake the dead if we're not careful. Better than sailing into Vex's cannon range like lambs to slaughter." Cross began distributing weapons to the dozen men he'd selected for the mission. Each had volunteered, despite understanding the odds against success. Besides, surprise is worth more than numbers in this kind of fight. Meanwhile, aboard the Devil's Maiden, Magnus found himself bound to the opposite side of the mainmast from Isabella, close enough to touch her yet separated by iron shackles that bit into his massive wrists. Vex had positioned them deliberately, able to see each other's suffering but powerless to provide comfort or protection. "Tell me about your noble upbringing, Lady Isabella," Vex taunted as he paced between his prisoners. "Did they teach you in finishing school how to manipulate the emotions of dangerous men, or was that a natural talent you discovered on your own?" Isabella's eyes never left Magnus's face as she answered. "They taught me that true nobility comes from actions, not titles, that protecting others is more important than protecting yourself. That love is worth any sacrifice." Magnus saw the truth in her storm-grey eyes. Whatever deception she'd practiced regarding her background, her feelings for him were genuine. The realization cut through his anger, like sunlight through storm clouds, leaving behind only regret for the harsh words he'd spoken in his cabin. "How touching," Vex sneered. The giant and the governor's niece, star-crossed lovers defying society's expectations. It would make a fine romantic ballad if it weren't so pathetically naive. "What do you want, Vex?" Magnus asked, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder. "You have us both. Name your terms." "My terms?" Vex's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "I want you to understand exactly what you threw away your life to protect. This woman used you, Blackwood. She saw a useful monster and manipulated your loneliness to serve her own rebellion against family duty." Isabella struggled against her bonds, fury blazing in her eyes. "That's a lie and you know it, is it?" Vex withdrew a letter from his coat, expensive paper bearing an elegant feminine hand. "This is a message Lady Isabella sent to her dear friend Catherine Ashworth just before fleeing her engagement. Shall I read the relevant passage?" Magnus felt his chest tighten as Vex cleared his throat theatrically. "I simply cannot bear another day of suffocating propriety. Perhaps a taste of adventure among the lower classes will give me stories worth telling when I eventually return to civilized society. Pirates and smugglers must lead such fascinating lives compared to our endless rounds of tea parties and social obligations." The words hit Magnus like physical blows, each syllable confirming his worst fears about Isabella's motivation. She'd written about him, about all of them, as entertainment, exotic specimens to be studied and discarded when their novelty wore thin. "Magnus, please," Isabella said desperately. "I wrote that letter before I knew you, before I understood what real connection felt like. Those were the thoughts of a spoiled girl, not the woman who fell in love with your gentle heart. Fell in love," Vex's voice dripped mockery, "or fell into an amusing fantasy that became inconveniently complicated when real consequences appeared." Magnus stared at Isabella, searching her face for any sign that Vex's accusations were false. But the letter's words echoed in his mind, painting their entire relationship in shades of manipulation and deceit. Had she ever seen him as more than an exotic adventure? Had her gentleness been real, or simply masterful acting? The sound of musket fire echoed across the water from the direction of Port Royal, followed by the distant boom of cannon. Vex smiled coldly as his lookouts called down reports of ships moving in the harbor. "It seems your loyal crew has decided to attempt a rescue, Blackwood. How unfortunate. Now I'll have to kill them all along with you and your precious lady." The cannon ramrod Isabella had spotted lying forgotten beside a gun carriage became her weapon of salvation when Vex's attention turned to the approaching sounds of battle. Her aristocratic upbringing had included lessons in deportment and needlework, but desperation taught her things no finishing school could provide, like how to use the sharp iron tool to pick the lock on her shackles, while her captors focused on the threats surrounding their ship. The sea battle erupting around Devil's Maiden was unlike anything Magnus had witnessed in 15 years of piracy. His crew had approached from 3 directions simultaneously, William Cross leading the main assault from the harbour mouth, while Tobias Fletcher's group attacked from the rocky shoreline, and young Tom Bristol's boat created a diversion from the south. Vex's superior firepower meant nothing when his enemies refused to present conventional targets. The Tempest Fury's boats darted between cannon shots like angry wasps, using their small size and maneuverability to stay ahead of the heavy artillery that could destroy them with a single hit. "Cut me loose," Magnus commanded as Isabella worked frantically on his bonds. Around them, Vex's crew scrambled to repel boarders while maintaining fire on the attacking boats. The chaos provided perfect cover for escape if they could free themselves before Vex realized what was happening. "I'm trying," Isabella gasped, her fingers slippery with sweat as she manipulated the ramrod's pointed end against the lock mechanism. These weren't designed to be opened from the inside. A musket ball splintered the mast inches from Magnus's head, reminding them both that their position offered no protection from the crossfire now raging across the ship's deck. Vex's men were experienced fighters, but they'd been caught off guard by the coordinated assault and were struggling to organize an effective defense. There! Isabella's shackles finally clicked open, freeing her hands to work on Magnus's much larger restraints. Her smaller fingers could manipulate the lock more precisely, but the iron bands around his wrists had been forged to hold a giant strength. Magnus tested his bonds and felt them give slightly under pressure. The locks were sturdy, but the mounting brackets had been weakened by Isabella's improvised lockpicking. With enough force, the bracket shattered as Magnus threw his full weight against it, sending fragments of iron spinning across the deck. His left hand was free, giving him leverage to work on the remaining shackle, while Isabella kept watch for approaching enemies. "Blackwood." Vex's voice cut through the battle's din as he spotted their escape attempt. The pirate captain advanced with cutlass drawn, his face twisted with rage at seeing his carefully planned revenge unraveling. "Did you think your crew's pathetic rescue attempt would save you?" Magnus broke free from his remaining bonds just as Vex lunged forward. The giant pirate's size made him an easy target, but it also gave him reach and strength that smaller opponents couldn't match. He caught Vex's blade on his own cutlass, the clash of steel ringing like a bell above the surrounding chaos. "Isabella, get to the boats," Magnus commanded without taking his eyes off Vex. "Tell Cross to signal retreat. This isn't worth their lives. I'm not leaving you." Isabella hefted the cannon ramrod like a spear, its weight familiar now from her desperate lock-picking efforts. "We escaped together or not at all." Vex's fighting style was all speed and precision, darting in with quick cuts before dancing away from Magnus's powerful but slower responses. The smaller man's strategy was sound: wear down the giant with accumulated damage, while avoiding the crushing blows that could end the fight instantly. But Vex had made a critical error in his assessment of his opponent. Magnus fought not with the blind rage of a cornered animal, but with the calculated strategy of a man protecting something precious. Every parry, every riposte, was designed not just to defend himself, but to position his body between Vex and Isabella. "You still don't understand, do you?" Vex taunted between sword strokes. "She's nobility, Blackwood. Born to wealth and privilege, while you're nothing but a bastard orphan who learned to fight in gutters. What future could you possibly offer her?" "The future she chooses for herself," Magnus replied, his blade describing a silver arc that forced Vex backward toward the ship's rail. "Not the one others decide for her." Isabella saw her chance when Vex overextended himself in a desperate thrust, aimed at Magnus's heart. The cannon ramrod flew from her hand with all the strength desperation could provide, its iron point taking Vex in the shoulder and spinning him around with the impact. Magnus's cutlass found its mark while Vex was off balance, the blade's edge pressing against his enemy's throat, with just enough pressure to draw a thin line of blood. "Yield," Magnus commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power. Around them, the battle was winding down as Vex's demoralized crew began surrendering to Magnus's men. The governor's pardon papers rustled in the morning breeze as Governor Edmund Pemberton stepped aboard the Tempest Fury, his official entourage trailing behind him like nervous ducklings following their mother. The documents bore the royal seal of King George and carried enough legal authority to transform Magnus Blackwood from wanted criminal to legitimate privateer, with a single signature. "Uncle Edmund," Isabella said formally, though her voice carried none of the warmth family should inspire. She stood beside Magnus on the ship's deck, her hand resting on his massive arm in a gesture that declared her allegiances more clearly than any words could manage. Governor Pemberton was a thin man with sharp features and calculating eyes that missed nothing. His gaze swept across the assembled crew of the Tempest Fury, noting their respectful attention to their captain and the obvious loyalty that bound them together. These weren't the savage cutthroats his reports had described, but disciplined sailors who'd found their purpose under Magnus's leadership. "Isabella," the governor's greeting was equally formal, though his attention lingered on her appearance. 3 weeks of genuine labor had changed his niece in ways that troubled him. Her hands showed calluses from honest work. Her posture had gained confidence that came from independence rather than privilege, and her eyes held a determination that spoke of a woman who discovered her own strength. "I trust Captain Vex explained the circumstances that led to this meeting," Magnus said, his voice carefully respectful but firm. Vex himself stood in shackles nearby, his shoulder bandaged from Isabella's accurate throw, but his spirit clearly broken by his defeat and capture. He did indeed. Governor Pemberton unfolded the pardon papers with deliberate ceremony. "His accusations against you were creative. Fortunately, we were able to determine their accuracy through testimony from more reliable witnesses." The governor's investigation had been swift but thorough. Vex's forged Royal Navy Commission had been exposed by experts who recognized the inferior quality of its supposed official seals. More damaging to Vex's credibility were the testimonies of Port Royal's merchants and sailors, who spoke of Magnus's protection of the innocent and his crew's honor in their business dealings. The Crown recognizes that the Caribbean requires unconventional solutions to unconventional problems, Governor Pemberton continued, his political instincts allowing him to adapt to circumstances beyond his control. "Pirates prey upon our shipping, but experienced captains who understand their methods can provide effective countermeasures." Isabella squeezed Magnus's arm, understanding the significance of what her uncle was offering. The privateer's commission would legitimize Magnus's operations while giving him legal authority to hunt the very criminals he'd once counted as peers. It was a path to respectability that few pirates ever found. And the conditions? Magnus asked, knowing that royal favor always came with strings attached. Standard terms for privateering commissions. 20% of captured prize money goes to the crown, detailed reports of your operations, and the governor's eyes found Isabella again. Assurance that my niece will not be compromised by association with activities that might embarrass the family name. The unspoken threat hung between them like a sword. Magnus could have his legitimacy, but only if Isabella returned to her proper place in colonial society. Her uncle was offering a devil's bargain, respectability at the cost of the love that had transformed them both. That condition is unacceptable, Isabella said before Magnus could respond. Her voice carried the authority of a woman who'd found her courage in the face of impossible choices. I am not a child to be bargained with or a possession to be managed. My association with Captain Blackwood will continue because I choose it to continue. Governor Pemberton's face flushed with anger at his niece's public defiance. Isabella, you will not speak to me in such a manner. Your duty to your family. My duty is to live with honor and help others do the same. Isabella interrupted. Captain Blackwood has shown me what that means. He protects the innocent, provides for his crew, and uses his strength to build rather than destroy. If that embarrasses our family, perhaps we should examine what our family values. Magnus watched the confrontation with a mixture of pride and concern. Isabella's courage was magnificent, but her uncle held power that could make their lives impossible if wielded vindictively. The governor could revoke any pardon as easily as he'd granted it, could use his influence to turn Port Royal against them, could make the Caribbean itself hostile to their presence. Uncle, Isabella continued, her tone softening slightly, I know my choices have disappointed you, but I'm asking you to trust that the woman I've become is worthy of the family name, even if the path I've chosen isn't the one you would have selected for me. Governor Pemberton studied his niece's face for a long moment, perhaps seeing echoes of the stubborn determination that had built their family's fortune in the first place. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weariness of a man who'd learned that some battles couldn't be won through authority alone. The pardon stands, he said, extending the papers toward Magnus, with all standard conditions, except those relating to family association. It seems my niece has made her own arrangements in that regard. As Magnus accepted the documents that would change his life forever, he felt Isabella's hand tighten on his arm. They'd survived betrayal, deception, and violence to reach this moment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The wedding ring Magnus had forged from a piece of the Tempest's Fury's bronze railing gleamed dully in the Caribbean sunlight, its surface bearing the gentle hammer marks of a man more accustomed to wielding weapons than crafting jewelry. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights in the ship's forge, teaching himself the delicate art of metalworking, while his crew pretended not to notice their fearsome captain's sudden interest in domestic crafts. It's beautiful, Isabella said softly, examining the ring's simple but elegant design. Magnus had inscribed tiny anchors around the band's circumference, symbols of stability and hope that spoke to their shared maritime future. You made this yourself? With Tobias's help, Magnus admitted, his weathered cheeks reddening slightly. Turns out quartermaster skills include knowing which end of a jeweler's hammer to use. They stood together on the Tempest's Fury's quarterdeck as Port Royal's harbour stretched before them like a painting rendered in gold and azure. 3 weeks had passed since Governor Pemberton's reluctant acceptance of their relationship, and the legitimacy of Magnus's privateer commission had transformed their status from outlaws to respected members of the maritime community. The change hadn't been without its complication. Some of Magnus's crew had struggled with the transition from piracy to privateering, missing the freedom of taking whatever they wanted from merchant vessels. Others had embraced their new legitimacy, proud to serve under a captain who commanded respect rather than fear. Captain William Cross called from the main deck, where he was supervising preparations for their evening departure. Mrs. Henderson's boat is approaching with the wedding supplies. Isabella's transformation into a ship's captain's wife had required considerable improvisation. Traditional wedding ceremonies assumed the bride would have access to elaborate gowns and formal venues, but Isabella had chosen to adapt rather than conform. Her wedding dress would be practical enough for shipboard life, while beautiful enough to honor the occasion's significance. Miss Henderson had proven invaluable in preparing for a wedding that defied every social convention. The boarding house proprietor had embraced the romantic impossibility of their union with the enthusiasm of someone who'd spent years watching other people's careful choices lead to comfortable unhappiness. "The cake's a marvel," Mrs. Henderson announced as her boat drew alongside. "3 layers with sugar flowers, and I managed to find enough white silk to make your dress properly respectable. Though I still say you're both mad to have the ceremony on a pirate ship." "Privateer ship," Magnus corrected with a gentle smile. "We're respectable now, remember?" The crew of the Tempest's Fury had embraced the wedding preparations with surprising enthusiasm. Men who'd spent years fighting and plundering had discovered unexpected talents for decoration and celebration. Tobias Fletcher had woven garlands from tropical flowers, while Tom Bristol had practiced fiddle tunes for the dancing that would follow the ceremony. "Are you certain about this?" Isabella asked, as they watched her dress being carefully transferred from Mrs. Henderson's boat. "Marriage to a privateer's captain won't be the life of ease and security your uncle wanted for you." Isabella's laugh carried the wind-blown freedom of a woman who'd found her true calling. "Ease and security were never what I wanted. I wanted adventure, purpose, the chance to build something meaningful with someone who values me as a partner, rather than a possession." Magnus pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his massive frame, despite their size difference. "The life I'm offering won't be easy. Long months at sea, dangerous missions, uncertainty about when we'll see friendly ports. And the alternative is watching you sail away while I sit in some drawing room discussing the weather with other bored wives." Isabella's voice carried the conviction of someone who'd made peace with her choices. "I'd rather face storms beside you than safety without you." The afternoon brought a steady stream of well-wishers from Port Royal's maritime community. Captain Morrison of the merchant vessel Prosperity brought a wedding gift of fine china that would serve for special occasions in their cabin. The harbour master presented them with updated charts of the Caribbean's safest passages, marked with notes about friendly ports and reliable suppliers. Even some of Magnus's former enemies offered grudging respect for his transformation. Pirates who'd once challenged his authority now acknowledged that his new legitimacy made him more dangerous than ever. A man with the crown's backing was harder to oppose than a simple outlaw. As evening approached and the wedding hour drew near, Magnus found himself struggling with emotions he'd never expected to feel. For 35 years, he'd lived as a solitary figure, defined by his size and reputation. Tomorrow, he would wake as a married man, responsible not just for his own survival, but for Isabella's happiness and safety. "Second thoughts?" Isabella asked, reading the uncertainty in his storm-grey eyes. "Wondering if I deserve this much happiness," Magnus replied honestly. "Wondering if the world will let us keep it." Isabella stood on her toes to kiss his scarred cheek, her touch gentle enough to heal old wounds. "Then we'll make ourselves worthy of it, and we'll fight for it if anyone tries to take it away." Isabella's modified wedding dress caught the setting sun like captured starlight, its white silk practical enough for ship life, yet beautiful enough to make even hardened pirates catch their breath. Henderson had worked miracles with needle and thread, creating a gown that honored both tradition and the unconventional life. Isabella was choosing. The sleeves could be rolled up for work, the skirt wouldn't tangle in ship's rigging, and the bodice was reinforced to withstand the physical demands of maritime adventures. "You look like a sea goddess," Magnus whispered, as Isabella appeared on deck for their wedding ceremony. His own appearance had been transformed by his crew's efforts. His long hair was braided with silver cord, his best coat was brushed to perfection, and his massive frame was adorned with the ceremonial sword that marked his new status as a legitimate privateer captain. The sun painted the Tempest's Fury's deck in shades of gold and crimson as Port Royal's most unusual wedding ceremony began. Captain Morrison of the merchant vessel Prosperity had agreed to perform the service, his authority as a ship's captain making their union legally binding despite its unconventional setting. "Dearly beloved," Captain Morrison began, his voice carrying across the water to the small flotilla of ships that had gathered to witness the ceremony. "We are gathered here in the sight of God and these good people to unite this man and woman in holy matrimony." Magnus felt his throat tighten with emotion as the familiar words washed over him. 3 months ago, he'd been resigned to a life of solitude, convinced that his size and reputation made him unworthy of gentle love. Now he stood before friends and former enemies alike, claiming the hand of a woman who'd seen past his fearsome exterior to the lonely heart beneath. "Magnus Blackwood," Captain Morrison continued, "do you take Isabella Fairweather to be your lawfully wedded wife to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Magnus replied, his deep voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "With all my heart I do." Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she spoke her own vows, but her voice remained steady. "I take you not just as husband, but as partner, Magnus. In adventure and in quiet moments, in storm and in calm, as captain and crew sailing life's waters together." The bronze ring slipped onto Isabella's finger as if it had been made for her alone, which in truth it had. Magnus had shaped every curve and angle with her delicate hands in mind, creating something that would remind her daily of his devotion. "By the power vested in me by God and the crown," Captain Morrison declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Captain, you may kiss your bride." The cheer that erupted from the Tempest's Fury's crew could have been heard in Port Royal's most distant neighborhoods. These men who'd followed Magnus through countless battles and adventures now celebrated his happiness with the enthusiasm of brothers luring a new sister to their family. Magnus's kiss was gentle despite his size, a tender claiming that spoke of reverence rather than conquest. When they finally separated, Isabella's eyes sparkled with tears of joy that caught the last rays of Caribbean sunlight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Magnus announced, his arm around Isabella's waist, "allow me to present my wife, Isabella Blackwood, co-captain of the Tempest's Fury." The title had been Isabella's suggestion, acknowledging that their marriage would be a true partnership rather than a traditional arrangement where the wife remained safely ashore. She would sail beside him, share his adventures, and help make the decisions that shaped their crew's destiny. Tom Bristol struck up a wedding reel on his fiddle, and the ship's deck became an improvised dance floor. Magnus and Isabella led the first dance, their size difference creating a spectacle that was both comical and deeply moving. The giant pirate moved with surprising grace, his massive hands gentle as he guided his bride through the steps. Other couples joined them, crew members dancing with each other in the absence of available women, Mrs. Henderson partnering with Tobias Fletcher, even some of the watching merchant captains accepting invitations to join the celebration. "This is perfect," Isabella whispered, as they swayed together under the emerging star. "Everything I dreamed a wedding should be, full of people who care about us, celebrating something real and honest." Magnus looked around at the faces surrounding them. His crew, their friends from Port Royal, even former enemies who'd come to pay their respects. Each person present had chosen to witness their union, to offer support for a love that defied social conventions and practical expectations. "Mrs. Blackwood," Magnus said, testing the sound of her new name. "I like the way that sounds." "So do I, Captain Blackwood." "So do I." As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, Magnus and Isabella stood at the ship's rail, watching Port Royal's lights twinkle like fallen stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new tests of their love's strength. Tonight was theirs alone, a perfect moment of happiness carved from an imperfect world. The shared captain's log lay open on their cabin's desk, its pages filled with entries written in two distinct hands, Magnus's bold script recording their official business, and Isabella's elegant penmanship, documenting the personal moments that transformed mere adventures into a life worth living. 6 months of marriage had proven that their partnership extended far beyond romantic love into genuine equality in all aspects of their maritime existence. "Listen to this," Isabella said, reading from an entry she'd made the previous week. "Today we encountered the merchant vessel Serafina under attack by Captain Rodriguez's crew. Magnus could have simply driven off the attackers and claimed salvage rights, but instead he chose to escort the merchant safely to Port-au-Prince, accepting only gratitude as payment. The crew grumbled about lost profit, but I saw pride in their eyes, pride in serving under a captain who values honor above gold." Magnus looked up from the charts he'd been studying, his weather-beaten face creasing into the smile that had become increasingly common since their wedding. "You make me sound more noble than I am. I write what I observe," Isabella replied, dipping her pen to add another entry. "Today I learned that my husband knows 17 different knots, can predict weather changes by watching seabird behavior, and still becomes flustered when I compliment his cooking. Also noted, the crew now brings their personal problems to both captains, understanding that we solve challenges together." The transformation of the Tempest's fury from pirate vessel to legitimate privateer had exceeded everyone's expectations. Under Magnus and Isabella's joint leadership, they'd captured 3 enemy ships, rescued dozens of enslaved people from illegal traders, and earned commendations from colonial governors throughout the Carib. Their reputation had evolved from feared to respected, a change that brought both satisfaction and new responsibilities. "William wants to know our heading for tomorrow's patrol," Magnus said, pointing to the navigation charts spread across their table. The governor received reports of slave traders operating near Martinique. Isabella studied the proposed route, her understanding of maritime strategy growing with each shared adventure. "That's a 3-day voyage, and we'll need to coordinate with the French authorities. Did you draft the diplomatic letters?" Magnus's grin acknowledged her gentle reminder of his weakest skill. Isabella's aristocratic education had proved invaluable in managing the complex relationships their legitimate status required. While Magnus commanded respect through strength and seamanship, Isabella navigated the treacherous waters of colonial politics with intelligence and charm. "Already written and sealed," Magnus confirmed, "though I still think you should handle the actual negotiation. You're better at making officials feel important while getting what we need." Their complementary abilities had become legendary throughout the Caribbean's maritime community. Stories spread of the giant captain who could crush enemies in battle, yet showed mercy to the defeated, and his aristocratic wife who could charm government officials into cooperation while personally tending wounded sailors during combat. The crew's been talking about homecoming gifts. Isabella mentioned adding details about their current course to the log. "Tobias wants to buy land near Port Royal when he retires. Tom Bristol is saving money to bring his sister from England. Even Cross is talking about settling down someday." Magnus nodded approvingly. The steady income from their legitimate privateering had given his men something pirates rarely possessed: hope for futures beyond constant danger and uncertainty. Several crew members had already left to start new lives ashore, replaced by sailors drawn to serve under captains known for both success and honor. "What about us?" Magnus asked, his voice carrying the vulnerability that still surfaced when discussing their future. "Any regrets about choosing this life over the comfortable existence your uncle wanted for you?" Isabella set down her pen and moved to the stern windows, where sunset painted the Caribbean in shades of gold and scarlet. "Do you see that horizon? Every day it offers new possibilities, new adventures, new chances to make a difference in the world. I could never trade that for tea parties and social obligations." She turned back to face her husband, her storm-grey eyes reflecting the contentment of a woman who'd found her true calling. "Besides, I married the gentlest man I've ever known. The fact that he happens to be a 9-foot-tall pirate captain just makes life more interesting. Magnus rose from his chair and gathered Isabella into his arms, marveling as always at how perfectly she fit against his massive frame. Through the cabin windows, the endless ocean stretched toward tomorrow's adventures, toward challenges they would face together as equal partners in love and leadership. The giant pirate, who'd once believed himself unworthy of gentleness, had found something more precious than any treasure, a woman who saw his true heart and chose to share her life with the man beneath the monster's reputation. And Isabella had discovered that true nobility came not from birth or title, but from the courage to follow one's heart toward love that transformed everything it touched.